Okay, it is 7 o'clock. We'll go ahead and get started. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our webinar, CV 101, which is part of our Get That Job webinar series here at the Champaign Public Library. My name is Jordan Neal, and I am the career librarian here at the library, so thank you all for joining us. Before I introduce our speaker, I wanted to mention some library information that we will reiterate at the end of the webinar, as well as some webinar details. So as you may or may not know, the library is open to the public with some modifications to the services that we offer. I invite you to visit our website, champaign.org, for more information. We are now available to answer your questions in person and virtually. However, you can chat with us just by visiting the homepage of our website. You can email us at librarian@champaign.org. We are still offering our Book a Librarian service virtually if you need any help at home. To request a session, visit champaign.org/book-a-librarian to fill out our request form. We are also still offering our curbside service if you wanted to pick up any library items, or you can now come into the library to pick up those items, whichever you prefer, or whatever you're comfortable with. Again, visit our website, specifically champaign.org/curbside, for more information. And as always, our e-library is always open, where you can enjoy ebooks, movies, and more using your Champaign Public Library card, or you can sign up for a virtual library card through our website for instant access. Finally, I'd like to briefly go over a few features available to you that might help during this particular webinar. Depending on your computer or device, if you take a look at your Zoom window, you can hopefully see audio settings at the bottom left of the screen. You can adjust your audio settings, like changing your speaker by clicking or tapping on the upward arrow next to your speaker. Moving to the center bottom of your screen, you'll see a chat and raised hand option. Clicking on the chat will open or close a chat box on the right side of your Zoom window, or sometimes it displays on the middle of your screen and you can drag it around, again, depending on your computer or device. We invite you to use the chat to ask questions or leave comments for us and our presenter. They will try to answer them throughout the presentations if they pop up. You also have the option to raise hand to receive any assistance. You can use this if you have any technical difficulties, or you'd like to speak and ask a question, so we can unmute you if you prefer not to type in the chat. Again, our presenter is happy to answer questions throughout the webinar, so please feel free to ask. So without further delay, I would like to introduce our presenter, Mike Firmand. Mike is the Associate Director for Career and Professional Development in the Graduate College at the University of Illinois here in Urbana-Champaign. Mike supports graduate students by advising students, coordinating major events and workshops, and collaborating with career units across campus. We are so glad he could join us today, so I'll go ahead and turn it over to you.
Thank you for the introduction, and thanks for having me. I'm happy to be here tonight to talk about CVs. Let me just do some switching around and hopefully get some sharing. Okay, does that look okay for everyone?
I can see it.
Perfect, excellent. All right, so again, thanks for the introduction. I think if I had to kind of boil down what I do at the university, I help grad students, so master's and PhD students, get jobs. And so looking at curriculum vitas or CVs is something I do quite regularly. And so this is something I'm very familiar with and happy to talk through. So let's get to it. So what am I going to talk about in this slideshow? Sort of the four main areas or topics or things that I'll go through. First, going to do kind of like what goes into the CV. So what does it look like and what should it have? How that is different or sometimes the same between a CV and a resume. And then I've got a couple samples that I'm going to show to highlight some different strategies or particularly effective things to do in a CV. And then I'll give you some tips for how to go about writing it, so the actual process of putting one together. And again, I like to keep it pretty casual, so as was mentioned, like, feel free to type in questions in the chat. I'll do my best to answer as we go through. So what is a CV? Well, it's a few things. I like to think of it as, what I like to say, a record. So it is sort of a comprehensive record of achievements, mainly in the areas of research, teaching, and service. So what does that mean? Essentially, it's like a record of scholarship. So it's like all of your academic and educational achievements, accomplishments, experiences go into a CV. It is a marketing tool because it's used in a job search, but it's a little bit more subtle, or it's less openly promotional than a resume would be, because it's primarily used in these academic or research contexts that just have a different sort of etiquette to their job search approach. All right, so that's pretty straightforward, but I think it's easier to kind of get a better sense of like what it is by talking about what goes into it. So let's talk some content and format. So the sections that almost always go into a CV are pretty straightforward. Contact information, so name, an email and a phone number, just like you would a resume. Your education, so any post-secondary degrees you've earned and or certificates listed out. And then experience specifically dedicated to research and or teaching. And so sometimes there's a different emphasis on those two. Like sometimes it's more focused about teaching or instruction. Sometimes it's more focused on research. Those really depend on kind of your audience that you're trying to reach and the context of the job or thing you're using the CV to apply to. So some things that might go into a CV but are not always necessary. So in line with the education, relevant courses, so more details of the coursework you've taken in your degree programs, honors and awards. So anytime you've achieved any kind of accomplishment or been recognized or received some kind of like award for your work in an academic context can be put in its own section. Academic service, so when we talk about service in this context, it really just means like it's essentially just like volunteer work that's dedicated to kind of things that are aligned with those other sections or those other aspects of the CV. So like research, teaching, academic service, essentially like things that you might do that are not required of you, but you just do because you're passionate, you're interested, you want to get involved. I think a word you might think of it as like extracurricular activities as a student. So we point out like roles in professional membership societies or organizations or being part of a planning committee. That's really kind of the things that make sense in service sections. And also professional experience. So that is, you know, paid formal roles, internships. I think the key distinction there and why it's different from a resume is even though it's a record of everything, sometimes you might have professional experience that is not like aligned or is relevant to sort of your academic pursuits or your education or your scholarship. So if it's professional experience that isn't relevant to the other aspects of the work, then it doesn't need to be included on a CV. Some things that just don't go into it, it's pretty similar to a resume in terms of like, you know, self-identifying demographic information does not need to be included. You don't need to put citizenship status, although, you know, I work with a lot of international students that do feel sort of like some obligation to like determine their work authorization on a CV. You can if you want, but it's not necessary. Absolutely no photos or anything like that. And we say like unrelated hobbies or interests just don't belong. So if you've seen some CVs before, like I find when I look at samples, and these are particularly samples that I find on the internet or in other places, like it ends up being just like a really long document that's almost like a list of lists. All these sections are just lists of titles or lists of roles or lists of awards. And I would encourage everyone to think about that it's more than just lists. It's very similar to the resume in that you want to use something like bullet points or additional description that goes into the details of your experience and what skills you applied when doing them. You can also add additional information on those things like awards and places you've been recognized that describe like why this thing is important, like how you got this award, why it's significant, what it shows from you. All of those like pieces of description are really important, kind of like building the CV to tell the story of your work. So, okay, I've already like said it a few times, and then there are ways that the CV is very similar to a resume and ways that but it's different. And sometimes employers will ask for one or the other. Sometimes they might be open to both. And it can be a little like confusing or not clear as to like, what do they really want? What does it matter? What's the difference? And so I would say that like primarily the CV is used or asked for in academic or research contexts because it is like a record of scholarship, a record of like scholarly work. They like ask for it when the main pieces are part of experience that you would have in academia or in higher education. And a resume is used pretty much in every other context for any other type of position or any other type of field. So I said it earlier, it was a record, and the idea behind the CV is comprehensive. It could just be like an entire career's worth of work. So it's a lot of, I guess, flexibility in terms of like what can go, like how much you add to it, because it can just include everything. Whereas a resume tends to be a little bit shorter because it's supposed to be a snapshot of what you've done that responds to a specific position. So it's not as comprehensive. And that's backed up because I was talking about sort of the flexibility and length. A CV can be as long as it needs to be. I've seen CVs that are 1 page long. I've seen some that are 12 pages long. They shouldn't feel compelled to like, it doesn't need to be any longer than it needs to be, because it's a little bit more rigid, I would say, in its contents. Like it's pretty much based in, those academic and scholarly pursuits. So those things go in there, but it can be as long as it needs to be to fill those things. As a resume, expectation is it's much shorter, but I think you have more flexibility and freedom in a resume to organize and categorize your experience in different ways. So think about it like this. There are two documents that are used in a job search that exist on the same spectrum. They're on the same line. And on one end, you've got something that can be really as long as it needs to be, but like fixed in a very like specific type of setting based on academic accomplishments. And the other one, expectation is much shorter, like usually a page, but is more skills focused and more about like your ability to do something like a job outside of an academic context. I really find that in most cases where there's confusion or they ask for both, what they're really looking for is something more like a hybrid, where the job might be in an academic or higher education or research setting, so that they're used to getting CVs, they're used to seeing CVs, but the job itself isn't one that you typically need something that's a huge long document of everything someone has ever done. And so in most cases where there is some confusion, where like the setting, maybe it makes sense, but it's not quite what they're looking for, what they usually want to see is some kind of hybrid. It's like essentially a resume that's a little bit longer and includes some of the more like academic credentials and work and experiences in it. So how should you know when to use like a CV or a resume, or do I need both, or when should I use it? So the first thing I would ask is like, so what is the context? So like, who is the employer? What's the kind of role? If it's higher education or a research-based position that's not a private company or sort of like industry-based, like a think tank, for example, or like an institute, they might ask for a CV. I would think about what, you know, who is the employer and what are they looking for in this role. If they're looking for someone who can, that's like mainly teaching based or research based, and they ask for a CV, they might understand what they're asking for and I can give them that. But pretty much if it's not something to do with that, higher education or a research based institute, like usually they're asking for something that's more of that hybrid, a longer resume. I also like to think about what else do they ask for in a job application. So it's very common if they're just asking for one thing, then usually they want a resume. But if they're asking for a CV or resume and other statements, so like things like cover letters or a statement of your teaching philosophy or a statement of your research experience, these are like additional cover letter type materials that dive into your expertise in an area. So if they ask for a lot of extra statements, that leads me to believe they're more looking for something like a CV. But, you know, all of these distinctions are like, you know, kind of strange and sometimes unclear or based on etiquette or employer preferences. I always like to take, you know, ask myself or ask someone, like, what do you think best represents you? What are you most comfortable with? Because, you know, you're the applicant, you want to control what you send them and make the most compelling case for that position that you have. And so, you know, crafting a resume or a CV or a hybrid kind of version, you know, whatever you think best represents you and gives you the best chance or makes the best case for you is what I would choose, because there isn't too much of a difference in how they look or how they're presented for you to worry too much about that. So on that point, I always think it's like just incredibly helpful to just look at some samples. And what I think is nice about, you know, people who attend talks like this is the samples that we have are a little bit more, I guess, verified or established to be like quality than just doing random internet searches and finding things that like may look a little bit confusing or don't make a lot of sense. So I've got 3 samples that I'm going to switch my screen share and I'm going to talk through, you know, what I like about them and what makes sense with them. All right. So again, just verifying, are people seeing hopefully a Christopher Careers PDF?
Yes, we can see it.
Great, excellent. All right. So this is a sample CV from my colleagues at the Career Center at the University of Illinois. And this is a sample that's meant to sort of capture someone who has a bachelor's degree who might be using a quote CV, something like a CV, to apply for like academic awards, scholarships, and or graduate school. So going into a master's or PhD program. And so I hope that it looks pretty familiar to everyone in terms of the way that it's presented. It should look like a lot of resumes that you've probably seen. So name and contact information at the top, starting with an education section, you know, a research/internship experience section, honors and awards, presentations, a very like straightforward linear formatting with a title that's underlined, a subtitle that's bolded, and then bullet points that provide more description. Pretty straightforward stuff. I think some things that I see in a lot of CV samples that I always kind of point out or push against is I will see a lot of CVs where the dates are actually on the left instead of the right. And I find that that is like a very kind of like persistent or stubborn formatting tick about CVs that I don't think is as effective as putting them over here in a way that you would normally do on a resume. Why is that? Because I've seen empirical research, anecdotal comments that all show that the way people read resumes and CVs is they read them in what we call like an F or an E pattern. So they start on this left-hand column and they scan very quickly, and then they see something that they want to read and they shoot across, and then they go back to this column and read down, and they're just reading really the first word of each part to see something that grabs them that they then want to read further. They're not doing a deep read of every single word on the first pass. And so a formatting like this that prioritizes the more interesting information on this side is more likely for that to get noticed and read. But I think where the difference is with the CV is things like honors and awards, presentations, collegiate activities. These are all sections that highlight that kind of like work that's done as a scholar, work that's done as a student, work that aligns with their field or their background, their kind of discipline of knowledge. So this person is getting a bachelor's in psychology, and so they have a research and internship experience because their internship, which someone might call professional experience, is actually based in their work in psychology. So that's why this person grouped them together, because it was a natural fit for the type of field or major that they were studying. So these things made sense together. But as you can see, even if this CV is only one page, it's got, pretty straightforward detail and description. There's nothing, it's nothing that looks too different from most resumes. It's more just to do with the content being centered around their scholarly work or work as a student studying in their field. So I'm going to switch over to the next sample. So these are our samples at the graduate college, and I just have two. So while the first one is really designed for someone who's potentially going to enter into a graduate program at a master's or PhD level, these samples are more at the end of that career. So someone who's been through a PhD program and who has developed a CV to apply for teaching or research positions. But again, as you can hopefully see from the formatting, like it's a very similar composition, name and contact information here, starting with education, listing the degree programs, and then going into a description of their teaching and advising experience with bullet points, with titles, dates on the side. Where there are some small differences, things like calling out in their education their dissertation or thesis title. So the big project they do as a student gets specifically called out underneath that program, and then even list the names of their mentors and advisors that work with them in this project. So that's a small difference that would be included on a CV, but not something that would ever end up on a resume. And then as we go down, we start to see this one is much longer with many more things. So after teaching, we have research, we have publications and articles that this person wrote, we have presentations this person has done, a whole list of honors and awards, their professional service, which is, again, essentially means like work they've done that's relevant to their field but wasn't expected of them as a student. professional memberships, all the different societies, and then a short references section. So this is a 3-page resume. CV. So for a CV, it's certainly not too long. It's pretty packed all the way through 3 pages, but it is also meant to be just kind of a sample for all the way you would organize all the things someone might do after they spent 4, 5, 6 years in a PhD program collecting all of these different experiences. And it is more common on a CV to include a reference section, whereas for like a resume in a job search, if they ask for references, they often ask for it in a separate document or as part of an application platform that you're applying to. But in a CV, it is common to include references at the end. One other sample, again, hopefully the format and the structure of it looks very familiar, but again, the idea behind it is that those sections of research, teaching, honors awards, service, those are things that this person has done in an academic context as a student, as a scholar, and then puts them on there in those categories to speak to an academic audience. So all of these samples I will share at the end of the slideshow. I have a slide of how you can access these samples. They're available to view. We have them, that just go straight from our website. So if you're curious and want to dig deeper, you can have access to those. One thing I particularly like about them is I think the bullet point descriptions do a good job of showing some balance of the types of things you would want to emphasize and describe in a CV. So those are good, like, sample descriptions of how to write the bullet points. All right, so moving right along, going into some tips for how to write a CV. And one of the big things I think is if it's something that you want to write and you already have a resume, I would start fresh. Like, I would start over. I don't think it's a good idea to try to adapt one into the other. Like, certainly there could be overlap, and certainly there are things you will just kind of want to piece together. But I think because it is kind of designed for a different type of audience in mind, you should start fresh with a new document. I also think in terms of writing it, and I say this even when I'm giving advice on writing a resume too, I don't don't start at the quote beginning. Like, don't start at the top of page 1 with, the first line and doing your name. It sounds a little weird, but my recommendation for how to build out these types of application materials is to start in that middle piece. Start with the descriptions. Like, think of the experience or the role or the project that you want to describe, and just start making like the bullet points almost like you're just taking inventory of everything you did in a specific experience or a specific project. So just like if someone asked for a catalog of all the things that went into that role, what would it include? So you're just writing a list of everything that you've done. You're thinking about the different skills that you applied in those. You're thinking about the different accomplishments and goals that you met in that role. I think it's good to use numbers and think about ways to quantify. That's a good way to describe sort of the scope or the impact of an experience. And so once you have that sort of inventory of everything you did in a specific role, then it gets, I think, a little bit easier to pinpoint like how much you need to edit down, or like what is the most important thing, what is sort of your message behind including that information. Because you won't need to include everything, but I think it's easier to make those decisions after you've mapped it all out. And so if you could go down that list and think about each of those bullet points and think like, okay, with each one of these, what am I telling my audience? Like, what do I want them to know about me here? Do they care about this? And am I saying it? Am I writing it in a way that's really clear and concise? And so the nice thing about that CV or even a hybrid like CV/resume is that because you have some more flexibility with the length, the kind of like how relevant is it question is kind of like less important, and it's more just about like, is this something, am I writing this well, and am I kind of deciding that I want this to be included? Am I making the point that I want them to make? Because as I showed when I was talking about the samples, is that on a first pass, no one is doing a deep read into every word. And because CVs can be as long as they need to be, going beyond 2, 3+ pages, I like to think of the approach as, I'm going to make every piece of information as easy to find for my audience as possible. I can't guarantee that they'll care about each piece, but I can guarantee they will find what they care about. And that's a nice aspect of a CV is just like, it can have everything if it's well organized, and I can trust that whoever is reading it will easily find what matters most to them because I've included it in a way that's like really nicely presented. And then in keeping with that record, so as part of the record keeping, is just to set a reminder, develop a habit that you shouldn't go too long without adding to it. It's nice to have that working draft that's just that inventory of all those things. And so rather than having to call back in memory in years past without updating it regularly, it's nice to just like every time you do something new or every 3 to 6 months, check in, add to it. That way you don't forget it. That way it's there. That way you can make that judgment call. Is this something I want to keep? Is this something that I want them to know about me? But it isn't lost in time to memory, and you can keep it updated pretty consistently. Again, I think do something new, make a point to add it, but maybe setting a reminder every 6 months, at least 2 times a year, to make updates to your CV. So here are the links to those samples. I went too far. I will, before I leave, I will put them in the chat too, because I think that's probably a little bit easier way to access them. We have a page, that middle one, we have a page on our website strictly dedicated to that like CV versus resume. So if my words didn't do a good enough job explaining the difference, I think if you're facing like a job ad where they're asking for both or it's unclear, we have that web page and you can go back to it and start to ask yourself some questions about what they really care about, where's the job, that can help you make that distinction and decide what do they really want. And I should have included, as you can see, that last slide is black. Usually I like to have a slide at the end that just says, do you have any questions? So without having that placeholder, I know I went through everything kind of fast because I tend to do that, but I'm happy to answer any questions. I'm happy to pull up the samples again if there were particular things you noticed that you want to ask about or discuss. I'm here to do it.
Well, thank you, Mike. That was great. If anyone has any questions, feel free to type them into the chat, or you can raise your hand and we can unmute you. So while we wait for that, I'm going to start sharing my screen if that's okay with you.
That's fine. I finally got those links.
Great.
And I'll put them in the chat for everybody. There we go.
Thank you. Let me make sure I can still see here. All right, well, thank you all again for joining us. Again, thanks, Mike, that was wonderful. Here is my contact information in case you have any further questions or if you want to connect with Mike in any way. like I said, we still offer our book librarian service, so we offer that via Zoom, Skype. We are offering them inside the building, but just for a few minutes, just because of this whole current situation. So Zoom works best for us. You could still see us and hear our voices, so just email me if you have any questions. And we hope you'll consider attending more of our webinars. Our next career webinar will be Resume and Cover Letter Basics next Tuesday, October 6th at 7 p.m., which I'll be presenting. And then here are the rest of the October career webinars. We have more webinars coming up related to our business series, our tech series, as well as our writers workshops and crafty adults. So please take a look at our events calendar online when you have the chance. Let's see here. Yeah, we have Bruce Bixler coming up. He was pretty popular over the summer, so he's coming back in October, so look out for that. And then my colleague, Kat Purcell, will be presenting a Job Search 101. And then we have an Emotional Intelligence Workshop by Janice All. Again, visit champaign.org/events for more information. And yeah, that's all I have. Once again, the library is open again. We can help you in person and virtually. You can chat with us. You can email us. I'll leave this here on the screen just for a little bit longer. And as far as the Zoom appointments, we don't even have to jump. I've been helping a lot of people, of course, with their resumes, but if you want to just do introductions for the first meeting, we could certainly do that as well. So let me check the chat if there's any questions. It's a quiet group tonight. All right. All right, well, I guess we could go ahead and end this webinar if we don't have any questions. Mike, thank you once again.
Thank you. It was my pleasure.
All right, I'm going to go ahead and end the webinar, everyone. Everyone have a great night. Take care. Bye-bye.